Next slide. Investigation of previous employment. Aramark shall contact all former employees of the driver applicant for the previous 3 years, CDL 10 years, to verify as much of the following as possible: dates of employment, type of work performed, type of vehicles operated, extent of driving experience and verifiable miles, vehicle accident record, attendance and reliability, overall work history and performance, record of misconduct regarding employment policies. All former employer information gathered from Aramark's inquiries will be documented in writing and will be retained in the DQF if the applicant is hired. In the event a former employer refuses to release information, a note stating this will be placed in the DQF. Aramark has retained the services of J.J. Keller to verify all employment information required above. J.J. Keller will be responsible for collecting and retaining the required information for the DQF for all Aramark CMV drivers. Additionally, any adverse information received by J.J. Keller will be immediately forwarded to the hiring manager for consideration in the hiring decision. Aramark shall review all former employer information to determine if the driver applicant meets Aramark standards regarding past employment, and to determine if the applicant was truthful about information listed on the employment application. Any driver applicant who fails to disclose a prior employer in the application process will not be hired. Additionally, each applicant is required to fully explain any gaps in employment on their application. If Aramark determines after hire that an authorized driver falsified his application by omitting a prior employer, then Aramark may terminate the employment of that person. Controlled substance and alcohol test information from previous employers. CDL driver applicants must provide written authorization to Aramark so that it may obtain controlled substance and alcohol test information for each of the driver applicants' previous employers during the preceding 3 years. All information from former employers regarding drug and alcohol test results must be in writing and will be retained by J.J. Keller if hired. In the event no response is received from a former employer, a note stating this will be placed in the file. J.J. Keller has been retained by Aramark to collect and retain this information for all CMV driver applicants. Next slide. Aramark will not consider for employment any driver applicant who has refused a drug or alcohol test, failed a random, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, return to duty, or follow-up alcohol test, or tested positive for controlled substances while with a previous employer. Additionally, if Aramark discovers a positive pre-employment test, the applicant will not be considered for employment. Physical examination certificate. Aramark requires driver applicants to be fully qualified physically to perform all duties and functions of driving and safely operating a CMV. Pre-employment DOT physical examinations will be performed by a qualified medical examiner as determined by Aramark in its sole discretion. Aramark has retained the services of J.J. Keller to coordinate and review all medical exams for CMV drivers. J.J. Keller will ensure drivers are sent to DOT qualified providers for the DOT physical exam. Without limiting any provision in this policy, Aramark retains discretion to change its requirements and determinations as to qualified medical examiners when and as DOT regulations change. Driver applicants who successfully pass the physical examination will be issued a medical examiner certificate card, which must be accessible to Aramark as to form content and qualification of the issuing medical examiner. A copy of the medical examiner certificate card will be sent to J.J. Keller and placed in the DQF, and the original will remain in the possession of the driver at all times while on duty or operating an Aramark motor vehicle. Pre-employment controlled substance alcohol testing. Aramark requires CDL driver applicants to submit to a DOT pre-employment drug screen to be conducted at a collection site designated by the company. These driver applicants shall not be offered employment until a negative test result has been reported. Aramark may conduct pre-employment alcohol testing. The test will only be required after making a contingent offer of employment. The offer of employment is subject to passing this alcohol test. The applicant will not begin performing safety-sensitive functions unless the results of the alcohol test satisfy the requirements of DOT regulations. Aramark has retained J.J. Keller to coordinate all controlled substance and alcohol testing for CDL CMV drivers. Hiring managers need to contact J.J. Keller, next slide, to ensure all testing is completed prior to a conditional offer of employment. Road test and certificate. Aramark requires all non-CDL driver applicants to successfully complete a road test examination conducted by Aramark personnel or their designee after a conditional offer of employment. The road test examination shall be performed in the type of vehicle the driver will operate for Aramark. Aramark's road test examination will include, but is not limited to, the following areas: a complete pre-trip inspection, placing the vehicle in operation, using the vehicle's controls and emergency equipment, driving in traffic and passing other vehicles, turning, braking, and slowing by means other than braking, backing and parking, other slow-moving operations, safe coupling and uncoupling procedures of a combination tractor and trailer, load cargo securement. Aramark, which is required to provide a record of road test examination form on which the driver's skill and each operation listed above is to be rated. The form is to be signed by the Aramark person or his designee conducting the test. The original of this record will be recorded and placed in the DQF. The official conducting the road test must be duly qualified to conduct such a test under applicable DOT regulations and must otherwise be approved by the Fleet Services Department in its sole discretion to conduct such tests. Upon successful completion of the road test examination, the official who administered the test will complete a certificate of road test. A copy of the certificate will be given to the driver, and the original will be sent to J.J. Keller and placed in the DQF. Aramark will accept a valid CDL from driver applicants in lieu of passing a pre-employment road test. However, BUs have the discretion of requiring road tests of all CMV applicants if they deem it necessary. Driver orientation and safety training. As a condition of employment, all newly hired authorized drivers will be required to successfully complete the Fleet Services Department Driver Orientation Program and Safety Training Program as developed, issued, and managed by the Fleet Services Department and as required by law. Aramark does not allow, next slide, the hiring of entry-level CDL drivers. If a business unit wishes to deviate from this policy, they must receive permission from the Fleet Services Department prior to hiring any entry-level CDL drivers. The Fleet Services Department will ensure the business unit can conduct the required entry-level driver training as required by DOT regulations prior to approval. Requirements of employees, vendors, or third parties who drive a commercial motor vehicle within the scope of their employment, business, or contractual relationship with Aramark. It is the responsibility of authorized drivers to be in compliance with all applicable provisions of the FMCSR, whether or not specifically identified or described herein. Failure to comply with these safety regulations will result in the loss of driving privileges for Aramark and/or disciplinary action up to and including termination. Some specific requirements include valid driver's license. Authorized drivers must have in their possession a valid motor vehicle driver's license for the vehicles they will operate. Authorized drivers may not possess more than one license. If an authorized driver possesses more than one license, he or she is required to keep the license from his or her state of residency and return the additional licenses to the state that issued them. Merely destroying the license is not acceptable. Authorized drivers must notify the state. Notification of license suspension, revocation, or cancellation. Authorized drivers are required to notify Aramark the next business day and prior to any driving activity of any revocation or suspension of their driver's license. If an authorized driver's license is suspended or revoked as a result of actions not including the use of an Aramark vehicle, the authorized driver's driving duties will be immediately suspended pending investigation. If an authorized driver's license is suspended or revoked as a result of actions involving the use of an Aramark CMV, the driver will be immediately suspended without pay and subject to appropriate disciplinary action up to and including termination. If an authorized driver's license is permanently suspended or revoked, the driver will be immediately terminated from Aramark. Next slide. Note, to the extent that these procedures are inconsistent with the language of the applicable collective bargaining agreement, the terms of the CBA shall govern. Compliance with applicable laws. Authorized drivers are required at all times to be in compliance with all applicable federal, state, and local laws. In the event that an authorized driver receives a citation for violation of a state or local traffic law other than parking, the authorized driver is required to report the violation in writing by the next reporting workday to his or her manager or supervisor, and for CDL, authorized drivers must notify the state that issued the CDL if the violation occurs in a state other than the state which issued the license. Permit operation of Aramark vehicle. Authorized drivers may operate an Aramark CMV only in connection with Aramark-related business. An authorized driver is not permitted to operate an Aramark CMV for any other reason. Any deviations from this section must be approved by the Fleet Services Department. Driving proficiency. Authorized drivers must continue to demonstrate proficiency in driving the Aramark CMV operated by the driver. Authorized drivers are not permitted to operate a vehicle in a reckless manner, which means, among other things, exhibiting wanton or willful disregard for the safety of other persons to the Aramark vehicle or other property. Authorized drivers shall not consume alcohol or illegal drugs prior to or during the operation of an Aramark vehicle. Authorized drivers shall not operate an Aramark vehicle if impaired by or under the influence of alcohol or drugs. CMV drivers must notify their manager if they are prescribed any medications that may impair their ability to safely operate a vehicle. The manager must ensure that the driver will not be impaired while operating an Aramark vehicle. Any questions should be directed to J.J. Keller, Human Resources, or Aramark Fleet Services Department. Physical qualifications. All authorized drivers of CMVs are required to obtain a physical examination at least every 24 months. The examination must be made by a qualified medical examiner acceptable to Aramark and shall be recorded on the prescribed form in accordance with the FMCSR. The completed medical examination form shall be retained on file at the office of the medical examiner, and a copy shall be retained in the DQF by J.J. Keller for 3 years from the date of execution. Authorized drivers are required to carry a copy of the medical certification form at all times. Next slide.